Hello again, this is SickleYield, and I'm here to talk to you about texturing with 3D Coat for Daz Studio. Disclaimer before we start. Texturing is not my area of greatest expertise. I will be the first to admit this, but both some of my most lucrative and least lucrative products have been textured almost exclusively in 3D Coat. So I think the program is very worthwhile, and it's one of the less expensive options if you're just entering our market and you find that you need a 3D painting tool that's a bit more easy to use and robust than Blender, but cheaper than ZBrush. Blacksmith 3D is another option that I urge you to examine. I can't tell you a lot about Blacksmith 3D. I do own it, but I have usually preferred 3D Coat's interface and chose to use that instead. There are some really great artists in our market who have used that primarily and produced great work, including Phoenix 1966 and, I believe, the late great Studio Art Vartanian. In the meantime, here is Genesis 3 Mail in Daz Studio 4.9 Pro. Here is 3D Coat, and I have textured Genesis 3 Mail all blue here. I'm going to show you how to create a textureless materials preset because you want to do that before you export to 3D Coat. What I'm going to teach you now is some necessary workup. Once you have created it one time, you should be able to use the same files again, so hopefully you only have to do a lot of this once. But for the moment, I'm going to go to my shader presets, assuming you had loaded a Genesis 3 Mail that had textures on it and was not blue for modesty on DeviantArt, and I'll go to the iRay folder and Daz Uber. And there, I will pick one of these presets that overwrites textures. I think the rubber shiny does, or plastic smooth. You can run through a few different ones. Plastic smooth, you can see, doesn't change the diffuse color there. But I think that the metallic paint ones do. Yes, the car paint sunburst one does. So if you make sure that all of these surfaces in the Surfaces tab are selected by clicking on the word Surfaces in the Surfaces tab when you have Genesis 3 Mail selected, then you can go to this Daz Uber folder, click on Car Paint Sunburst, then go down and click on Rubber Matte, Rubber Shiny, any of those, and then just set the base color back to white. There we go. And you can now save that as a materials preset for your Genesis 3 Mail. I keep a different directory for things that I've saved for these quickie things. I'll just say materials preset, white, and accept. And now I have a mapless white preset. This is important because if I'm going to texture, I don't want there to be textures that Daz has made on this figure. So now I'm going to pose this in a way that makes more of the body accessible to me for painting purposes. I am going to raise the arms. I'm just going to do one side and then mirror it to the other is what I'm actually going to do. So I'm also going to go to the pose controls and dial up toes spread. And then on the hand, I will do right hand spread from the pose controls dialog. And you'll have to repeat the pose controls on the other side because those don't apparently mirror. But first, just hit Shift Y. The Symmetry dialog comes up, and I'm going to select Root, Recursive, and right to left, and mirror across Y-axis. And I'm not going to change anything else about this before I click Accept. Now, it makes this symmetric preset. I will still have to go and dial in those two finger and toe spreader pose controls on the left hand and the left foot. Okay, and then I'm also going to go and close his eyes and open his mouth so that I have access to his eyelids and the inside of his lip. Usually I'm going to create a separate mesh of just the mouth and teeth for painting those areas because I'll need to lift the tongue. For the moment, I'm just going to look at the main body texture and not the ones that require separate shaders like the mouth and the eyes. The techniques that I will teach you today can be applied to those areas also. But first of all, I'm going to go to Pose Controls, Head, and I'm going to go to Eyes and Eyes Closed, Mouth, and Mouth Open Wide. There we go. Now before we move this to 3D Coat, we want to consolidate the materials. And you don't want to save this figure back to the library like this. That is a bad idea. But for the moment, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through here and consolidate materials that are on the same map, or ones that I know I'm going to delete. For example, I'm going to hit plus on the cornea and the sclera and the eye moisture, and I am going to then right click on the irises and hit assign faces to group. You can see that those surfaces have now gone to 0 under count. That means that they no longer affect any polygons. This is the tool settings tab that I'm looking at. If you don't have a tool settings tab, you can create one by going to Windows and Panes tabs and picking that out from the list. And then you can drag it into place in your interface wherever you want it to go. So now that I have these different materials at 0 faces, I'm going to right click on each one and say remove selected group. And normally you would not want those all on the irises group, but today we're actually going to be deleting, do the pupils also, we're actually going to be deleting that geometry in 3D code so that it's not exporting things that we later have to delete for efficiency's sake. So I'm also going to select the fingernails and apply those to, actually first I'm going to deselect the other things, geometry selection and clear selection in the 3D window. You get these options when you right click in that 3D window. So I'm going to click on fingernails, a little plus sign here, and right click on arms and assign selected faces to group, and then I'll delete the fingernails group. And I will do the same with the toenails and assign that to the legs. There we go. We want as few of these material groups as possible in 3D Coat for reasons that I will show you as we get further along. So for the face UV, I know that the eye sockets, ears, and lips can all go on that. So I'm going to assign all of those to the face UV. Periodically I'm going to clear the geometry selection before I go to a new group so I don't accidentally assign eye parts to the lips or anything like that. So I'm going to hit lips plus, eye socket plus, and ears plus. And then I'm going to go to face and assign selected faces to group. And then I know that I did that correctly because those all went to 0. And nothing else went to 0, so I know I didn't assign the wrong thing. If you assign the wrong thing, you may have to save this pose to the library, delete everything, and restart Daz Studio. And indeed, if you want to use Genesis 3 Mail again, you will need to restart Daz Studio, or it will retain these messed up material groups when you reload him from the library, but only once. I don't know why it does that, but it does. Meantime, I'm going to also assign the teeth to the mouth group. Okay, so now I have, and the eyelashes. Eyelashes to the irises group. So now I have arms, face, irises, legs, mouth, and torso. The mouth and irises groups represent geometry that will be deleted because I'm not working on it today. In the end, I've actually consolidated all of the geometry I want to ultimately delete into this irises group. So right now that includes the teeth, the inner mouth, the eyelashes, all of the parts of the eye itself. Basically everything that isn't this continuous outer skin. I want to retain the materials of arms, face, legs, and torso. And now I'm ready to export this mesh that I can now use for texturing Genesis 3 Mail and 3D Coat from now on. Texturing the Gens geograft is an entirely different and somewhat lengthy subject that I'm not going to cover today. Not because I wish to conceal any information from you, but because that causes problems with YouTube, and I might have to do it as a PDF or something like that. So for the moment, I'm going to go to File and Export. Actually, before I go to File Export, I'm going to go to Parameters and Currently Used, and I am going to turn off the mouth realism and navel morphs so that we don't have a indentation here that's hard to paint on, or it doesn't matter as much with the realism because we're going to delete that geometry, but it's a good habit to have. Then I'll go to Mesh Resolution, and I'm going to set this to Base and Subdivision to 0. Painting might be smoother with subdivision on, but that might also cause unnecessary seams. So now that I've done that, I'm going to go to File, Export, and OBJ. And I'm going to save it to any file of my choosing, any folder. And I'm going to use the Daz Studio scale because I know that 3D Coat can handle that pretty well. And there's not a 3D Coat scale preset in Daz Studio at this time. So then I will click Accept. Then I'm going to start up 3D Coat. I'm going to close this gray panel by hitting the X, and I'm going to go to File, Import, Model for Per Pixel Painting. And I will navigate to that wavefront OBJ that I exported, and I will import that. And I'm going to go down here to where it says 1024 on all of these, and I'm going to change the first one to a 4096. It should change everything to that size. And you can even go bigger than that if your system will support it. I can just about handle 4096 by 4096 on mine. Or if you want to do a specific different value, you should be able to enter that under custom texture size. For some reason it went to 256 when I told it to do that. But I'm going to go back to 4096 and that will work for today. Then I'll click OK, and it should load in my Genesis 3 mail with my blank white material, and I will show you how to delete the unwanted geometry. Here he is. I am going to save this first thing because 3D Coat is relatively stable for a large 3D application. That doesn't mean it's relatively stable in general. I keep a file on a separate hard drive for 3D Coat saves, and I save to that folder. Call this 3DC tutorial test. The program kind of wants you to save to your documents folder or to its own folder. I don't do that because if anything goes wrong with the program, I'm always paranoid about losing saves. So whenever possible, I always save to a folder external to where the program originally prompts. Now here's Genesis 3 Mail in this interface. You might be able to tell, depending on how much you have this video magnified or how large you're looking at it on your screen. I can rotate him by hitting this little rotation marker up on the top bar toward the right. And if you hover over that, it actually tells you how to do that. It says rotate the camera by holding the LMB down over this control and moving the mouse. To rotate the camera without this control, use Alt LMB, meaning Alt left mouse button. So if you hold down Alt and drag the left mouse button, you can rotate around the character. I find that to be faster. Then you use Alt and the middle mouse button to move up and down, or side to side, in more the plane that you're looking through. And I don't remember what the scale one is. It's Alt right mouse button, like that. There we are. And you can also switch from orthographic to perspective view and back with this little cube here. There's orthographic view. Over here on the left, you will find your tools panel. The one we're going to be using the most is the little paintbrush, but there's also the clone stamper, and down here further there's the eraser. Hovering over any of these will tell you the shortcut or hotkey to switch to the one you want to use. Also important, up here at the top there are these two color panels, the primary and secondary colors. Right now, white is the default off color, and it's also the default primary color. I'm going to leave that there for a minute, and I'm going to go over to the right. On the right you see the tool options, the brushes dialog, which has all these brushes that come loaded by default with 3D Coat. I'm going to have that onto this sort of soft circle here. I'm going to use that the most. Sometimes I'll use the slightly less soft one next to it, but for painting textures on a body from skin sources, I'm often going to use that softer one. And then down here you have the materials dialog, which I will get to momentarily. And below that you have this list that says layers, blending, materials, objects, vox tree. Layers and materials are the two that interest us there for the moment. It has already set up layer 0 and layer 1 for you. And I'm going to go to specular and set it to 0% here, and do the same with depth, because we're just painting our diffuse texture here. My experience is that you can try to paint depth with 3D Coat, but I have not had good results with that. So now I'm going to go to this materials list by clicking on it, and there you can see the list of materials that we exported from Daz Studio. Now the one that says irises contains our geometry that we want deleted. I'm going to zoom in on the face area there. There we go. And then I'm going to click the little X next to the word irises. You get this pop-up that says this operation cannot be undone. And I'll say yes. And it will delete all of that geometry. Problem solved, and I will save this file. There we go. Now I'm ready to start painting. To do this, you will need a photo resource. I bought some from 3DSK. That address is 3d.sk online. And I do recommend them. They have a lot to offer. They are expensive. There are a few other places where you can get photo sources. They will tend to also be expensive because the person taking the photos has to have a good enough studio and they have to be able to find people that are willing to pose for that. I think that Renderosity may still have a couple of these resources. And of course you have the option of photographing bits of yourself if you have a good enough camera. You can explore options, but in general, finding people that are willing to pose for texturing is difficult, so finding photos for texturing will be expensive. You can also try texturing from a merchant resource, but that is a topic for another day that I'm not going to address here. So right now, what I'm going to do is go to the folder where I have stored these face photographs that I bought from 3DSK, and I'm going to left click on one and drag it over here to the materials shelf, and it will ask if I want to use it for depth, color, and specular, and I'm going to X out depth and specular and then hit OK, and it will create that as a new material and it will jump into this other mode. For some reason it has come in somewhat compressed, so I'm going to go up here and hit reset. There we go. And then I can scale in and out with a little magnifying glass on this little toolbar that's popped up. There's a widget for moving the thing around. You can always hit reset if you get lost again. And you can change the proportions of that with this other widget that's narrower and on the right. Part of the reason I'm in orthographic mode is because it makes this part of the process easier, because I'm going to try to line up this face with the face of Genesis 3 male as best I can, including changing the proportions a little bit and moving that around. As you can see, the eyes are going to be more wide set and higher up, but that's okay because I don't actually want those darker nostril marks. And if you want to change the view of your actual scene here, you actually need to use the view up at the top or use Control drag left mouse. That's going to mess up the lineup with your photo, so you want to use movement with care. For now, I'm just going to paint the nose area. I'm going to hit bracket to scale this down, and I'm going to do that, and you're going to look at this and ask yourself, why is that neon orange? This is an interesting little wrinkle with just 3D coat. I'm going to hit Control Z to undo that. We actually need this primary color to not be pure white. I'm actually going to drag it down into a light gray. Unfortunately, it doesn't really let you save colors, but it will tell you what the hue, saturation, lightness value is, so it's 0, 0, and 74% here. Now when I paint, it'll be a little bit less neon orange, but it's still a bit darker than I really want. So I'm going to keep tweaking my paint colors until I get something that's less orange. Because if you look at how it's painting it and how it looks in the original, it's actually pretty close. It just looks more orange because we're painting on a dead white Genesis 3 male there. But the exact tint is something that we can actually sort of correct afterwards. But you can see I've sort of painted on the cheek area and the upper part of the nose here. And then when I need, for example, the closed eyelid, then it's time to go back to my folder and find that part of the texture and drag it back over here to 3D coat, go through that process again. And there we go. And I'll just drag that around to the eyelid. And rotate and scale it until it's approximately where I need it to be. And this is nice because this texture that I've got has some between the eyes space here too that I can paint. It's a little too dark there because of the way the shadows were picked up on the original texture. So when I have a problem like that, something that I can do is to drag in one of these little squares of skin texture that also came with this set. You can create a tiled one yourself by cropping and tiling a piece of another photo resource that you have. And this I'm actually going to put on a second layer. So down here in the layers dialog, I can hit this little piece of paper button, layer 2, and I'm going to hit the down arrow to put that below layer 1, because I'm actually going to sort of use it for fill in behind these others. And you can see that's actually really lumpy because I forgot to turn off the specular and depth on that. There we go. And now I've got this sort of tiled texture for fill around the eye and between the eye and the cheek without using the overly dark shading that that eye had. And I want to go up here and erase a little bit. I just hit Shift E because that's the hotkey on mine. And get rid of the unwanted eyelashes on the lower bit, because we don't want to paint eyelashes on this at all because those are actually in mesh. Now if I wanted this to be absolutely symmetrical, I could actually hit S and symmetry across S axis, and it would paint or erase on both sides at once. I'm not going to do that with body texturing because no human body or face is perfectly symmetrical in texture. Even if the features are perfectly symmetrical, having the texture be perfectly symmetrical often creates sort of an uncanny valley effect. So generally, I'm not going to choose to do that. So I'm going to go back to no symmetry here, and then I'm going to paint the other eyelid back on this top layer. And clicking on any of these materials from the materials pop-up here brings that one back up. I'm going to reset it because I've rotated it. I'll take this back over here and scale it down. I think that the mistake a lot of people make is in thinking that you actually have to go right up to the edge of everything, when in fact you want to sort of get the important areas like the wrinkles of the eyelid and then fill in around the edges with your tiled texture so that you don't get those orange shading problems. That's going to be a common issue because human skin looks different depending on the light that's shining on it. And even a studio with the most even lighting in the world cannot really do anything about that. I would paint the eyebrows on a separate layer also if you're going to do painting of the eyebrows, rather than include an eyebrow conformer with the set. I don't like painted eyebrows at all. They are a thing that I really dislike. So I am obviously prejudiced against that specific thing. See, I'm filling in around with that tile texture again here. There may be points when you want to clone. For instance, I've got a couple little stray hairs that have shown up on this side. So if I want to clone the cheek area over that, I'll click up to layer 1 here again. I'm going to hit the C key because that's the current hotkey I have for that. And hit the bracket to scale that up or down. Hold down Control, click on the area I want to clone from, and let go of Control, and I can just go paint on the area I want to clone to. That's not a good match because the cheek area is shinier, so I think I may actually prefer to clone from layer 2 there. And you can clone between layers. That is absolutely a thing that you can do. To extend the cheek area with the pores up a little further here. That's a way that we can do that. And if you want to partially erase, you can affect the transparency of the eraser or the extent to which it erases by going up here to the top bar. You will see the word opacity. I reduce that to 50 for when I'm using the eraser, and it will not erase as strongly. You can also paint with less opacity or anything else just by changing this number up here. And the other great use for that tiling texture, or I don't know that it's really tiled, that texture swatch, let's call it, is when we get to this area up here where my original model's face has hair, I can paint using that texture resource and create a bald head up here so that I don't require the Daz Studio final user to have hair on the texture where they don't want it. If you look at a photo source that has hair on it and you wonder to yourself, how do they get all of those bald people in Daz Studio? It's probably through a process like this. And I will... There's a couple pimples on here. I will clone that out. If you want there to be pimples on it, that's fine, but I don't want them, so I'm going to clone them out. And I actually have a couple of swatches like this on here. This is a great thing that you can actually get from your own skin. Most people have, you know, some stretch of skin on their body that's relatively smooth and one color. The side of your calf is a good choice for this, if you have a photo source that didn't come with that. And this has some nice pores on it. I'm just going to keep painting there. It's very tempting when I go to tweak these afterward in the GIMP to desaturate this to the extent that all the texture and all of the character and all of the detail disappears. That's certainly a mistake that I have made multiple times with projects I've done. So I certainly caution you against that. And I can just turn this when I'm ready using the regular navigation controls, and it's gotten stretched on the side of the face because I painted that from the front. Since we're on the side of the head here, where it's impossible for the viewer to see both sides at once most of the time unless they're looking at it from two different cameras, I will probably go ahead and turn symmetry on at this point. Symmetry across the x-axis, and I will go ahead and just keep on painting this over here on layer 2 because that's my tiled layer. And that seam sort of appears there. Let's look at our padding settings. Edit, Preferences. And it looks like I have it set to never use padding, so I'm going to set always make padding. And padding width, I'm actually going to set it to 16 since we're working with a larger texture, and OK. And that may not make the seam less visible in 3D Coat, but it will certainly make it less visible on export. I want to make sure I cover this seam so that you can see what that looks like in Daz Studio. I'm not going to paint the full texture in front of you all today. If I hit reset, you'll notice that it resets to whatever camera view I'm looking through. This is very useful. I'm not going to paint the entire body texture in front of you today, but I am going to paint enough of it that you can see a seam area and see that I've been successful in covering the seam. There we go. When I'm ready to do the ear, I can pull up the texture section that has the ear on it. This is really probably too small, but we're doing sort of a quick and dirty head texture today. This is not really Daz Store ready. Here we go. Reset. Scale down. And it's facing the wrong way, so I can either rotate my model and use the other side, or I can flip X. There we go. Drag this over that. It's easy to mess up the shading on the ear and hard to get it quite right, but we do need that rougher texture on the inside of the ear. So I'm going to spend a little more time on those areas of smaller detail to avoid, as much as possible, we want to avoid getting a tiled look to our mesh, to our character. So that when you look at this, you want to look like you're looking at the inside of an ear and not a smooth digital type surface. And that's the final goal of any texturing project from a photo. It's very hard to accomplish. And it's very easy to lose this detail again when you're trying to get rid of, for example, specular contamination, which is what I am calling those big highlights there that are a result of the photographic process. Those can be annoying and difficult to get rid of. So I'm going to paint over that on another layer here. close that for a second and see how that looks. It looks kind of messy. And because we're in 3D Coat, you can also sort of see the seam where the UV map of the ear joins the UV map of the head. So I'm going to go ahead and do the full tiling paint here, and then go back and maybe add some more details to the ear area. It's tempting to just paint that tiling over everything and then ignore a lot of those details, but that's important not to do. Body texturing is very competitive, especially for iRay, and part of the reason is that it is difficult and the standards that Daz has, in particular Daz, are high for the realism of a body texture. But it's not impossible, it just takes a little bit of work and a little bit of time, and it can certainly be done. There we go. Let's paint a little more of that on our layer 3 here. And you can change the opacity of this preview also. From this drop down that currently says 30%, I can change that to 10%. If I'm finding that the translucent preview is obscuring my screen too much for me. That makes it harder to see things on the preview, but it certainly makes it easier to see things on the screen itself. Okay, I think we've got enough, at least for you to see how that works. So there's our partial head. And I'm going to save again because export is another area where crashing is extremely common. And there are a few things more frustrating than finishing something, going to export the textures, and then having the program crash without exporting them. So I'm going to go to Textures, Export, All Layers Color, and I'm going to choose Face. Click OK. And I'll just save that to wherever. It's going to save out to PSD because it's saving all the layers. And then if I open this in the GIMP or Photoshop, you'll be able to see those layers. Here's how that face texture looks. You can see there are some gaps, and there's this big unfinished area down here, but you can certainly see the parts that we painted. You'll notice that this looks darker than it did in 3D Coat. The difference between painting in here and painting in Daz Studio, there's a significant color difference, and I found that very frustrating, but I have not yet figured out what to do about it other than to post-work brighten things that I've made. But the important thing here is that you can see those different layers. This gray layer has been added by 3D Coat, but you can see the rest of that, and you can actually clone between layers again in the GIMP or in Photoshop to fill in those holes, and as long as they don't approach a seam, you don't have to be super neat about it. So the biggest thing when you're painting in 3D Coat itself is that you make sure that you fully cover all of those seam areas. It still looks a bit messy. This is one where I might even 2D touch up the ear area by straight up pasting part of my photo source's ear over this, over the UV. The ear being one of the hardest parts to 3D paint. There's the eye socket area up there. For the moment, I'm going to export this half-finished one so that you can see what that looks like. First, I'm going to right-click, New from Visible, and then on that layer, I'm going to use Tools, Color Tools, Brightness, Contrast, and I'm going to brighten it up. And I'm going to save this preset because I will need to use the same one on every different texture for the rest of the body. So in the GIMP, I'm going to hit this plus sign and say Test Textured BC. There we go. And I will export this to JPEG for purposes of testing. Then I'll go back to Daz Studio, where I've got this white Genesis 3 male. I will make sure that I have him selected in the Scene tab. Then I will go to the Surfaces tab and the Face material, and I will hold down Control and also select ears and eye sockets and lips. I will go to Base Color, Browse, and navigate to that texture that I have just exported. And there you can see our incomplete face texture on the face, ears, etc. of Genesis 3 male. And then I'm going to go back to 3D Coat, and I'm going to do this again with Export All Layers Color. And from the UV Set dropdown, I'm going to choose Torso, and it should give us the back of the head area that we painted there. I'm going to call that Torso Head. And then I'll go back to the GIMP and open that. And once again, we should be able to see exactly what we painted. Wait for that to load. There we go. And I'm going to do New from Visible again. Yep, there's that back of the head area. And I'm going to use the brightness color preset that I created, and that will make sure that this matches the brightness and contrast of the face. There we go. Then I will go to the torso material of Genesis 3 male. Once again, I'll go to Base Color and Browse, and this time I will take that torso, and there it is. You can see there is no visible seam, even though we could kind of see the seam in 3D Coat. There's some hairs around the ear there that we didn't clone out. And you can see that it's symmetrical on either side because I missed a couple of little spots there. But in general, that's how you do it. There are some different ways to create other maps, bump and specular and etc., but a lot of them are based on altering this base texture. You can create a sort of bump map by using desaturate and then using brightness and contrast again to make a darker and more heavily contrasted bump map. If you do that, you probably need to also use dodge to lighten areas that you want to be higher. Obviously on the face this is not a big issue, but it is certainly an issue with, for example, the nipples. You may or may not even need a specular map depending on the project. Again, some actual texture artists may be gasping in horror as I say that, but generally that's going to be a little more contrasted so that the pores show up on it. There's one way to do that, like so. Once again, if you want an area to be shinier, you will need to use dodge on the forehead area or another area that would actually be shinier but will come out darker when you convert from the base texture. When you create a translucency map, that's actually a very different thing. Rather than compositing from photo resources, I'm going to create another layer here. I'm actually going to go Shift B here, which should start this fill tool. If it doesn't, you can just click on that to start the fill tool. There's the material preview. You can see that it's pretty much white because I have no modulation type. It'll just fill with the base color. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Layer up in this Tool Options, and it should fill the entire layer with that color. It hasn't destroyed any of my other work because I created a new layer. So when I go back to Paint, my textures are hidden, but if I hide that top layer, I can see the body texture again. There we go. And when I do the translucency, I want to start from a gray texture and then paint darker areas or veins or lighter areas onto it. So if I want to have little blue veins, I can hit Paint there, give myself a blue base texture using the color wheel here. And I will paint actually I'll turn the symmetry off, but I'll use blue to paint little veins onto that for translucency, and I may even paint a little pink onto the cheek or ear areas depending on what sort of settings you want to end up using, but usually I'm going to go with shades of gray and a little bit of blue for veins. Displacement is something that I do not use with iRay because it is difficult to manage and it greatly slows down the rendering. Generally, I will use a normal map instead. I have a different tutorial on doing that, which you can also find on my YouTube. I think that's all for now. This shows you the basics of how to paint a skin texture with 3D Coat. You can repeat this process with just the eyeball, hiding everything else, or cull all the geometry except the eyeball when you're ready to paint irises. You can do it with the mouth and just export with the mouth open to paint the inside of the mouth. And you can pose the tongue to make it easier to get in under there with projection and paint the tongue. I have used merchant resources more often for the tongue and mouth areas because it is such a pain to get that area fully painted. But it is certainly possible to do it because the people who did the merchant resources have done it. It just takes a little more time and patience. Alright, thank you for joining me today, and happy rendering!